This is a reaction video to HITC 7's about why isn't MLS rivaling Europe's biggest leagues yet. I have not seen this video. I'm going to react to it as I watch it.
There is a lot to admire and a lot to be positive about when it comes to Major League Soccer. Since reaching a nadir in terms of its popularity, shortly after the turn of the millennium, as the league lost $250 million over the first 5 years of its existence.
MLS started in 1996. I was at the very first game of the Columbus Crew. They played DC United, beat them 4-0. The first goal scored by the Columbus Crew in their franchise history was actually an own goal by DC United Thor Lee. But they won the game 4-0. The 10 teams that were there were the Columbus Crew, New York, New Jersey Metro Stars, DC United, Tampa Bay Mutiny, trying to think of the other, New England Revolution, Kansas City Wiz, Dallas Burn, Colorado Rapids, San Jose Clash, and the Los Angeles Galaxy.
And actually briefly went bust, unbeknownst to most people, the popularity of the top flight of association football in the United States and Canada has been on the rise ever since. At the start of this season, new MLS franchise Charlotte FC set a league attendance record, as 74,479 spectators packed into the Bank of America Stadium to witness the team's MLS debut against LA Galaxy. That is higher than the Premier League's record attendance this season, which is held by Manchester United. Meanwhile, the MLS, albeit we are only a few games into the current campaign, is currently on course for its highest ever average attendance figure this season of 22,628, which is higher than the average attendance in La Liga. It is undeniable that the quality of football, youth coaching, youth development, and with all of those factors following, have all increased greatly in the MLS over recent years. And that is great. 3 cheers for Major League Soccer. But what is also undeniable is that whilst the MLS might be able to rival the world's best leagues, and by that we basically mean Europe's best leagues these days, in terms of matchday attendances, they cannot yet rival the likes of La Liga and the Premier League when it comes to interest, revenue, or talent.
And I think the big thing there's going to be revenue, because look, you're talking about some of these clubs from the English Premier League are over 100 years old, and MLS has only been around since 1996. You're also not dealing with a salary cap in a lot of these leagues as well.
The MLS is highly competitive, wildly unpredictable, and there is a big emphasis on youth. In many respects, it is everything that a lot of European football fans, including myself, in increasingly predictable and top-heavy league systems would love for their leagues to be. So why does there appear to be a glass ceiling that is preventing the MLS from really kicking on and knocking the likes of the Premier League, La Liga, and Serie A off their perch?
I'm guessing it's probably how much you could make, and I know you can make a lot of money if you're if you're a certain kind of player in MLS. The word I'm trying losing my train of thought here. If you're a designated player, you can make an awful lot of money. But if you're not a designated player, you can't make as much money. You mentioned top-heavy leagues. Manchester United is not having a good year this year, but Manchester City is, Liverpool is, and you can see those teams being in the top of the leagues for quite a while. Go to Spain, it's Real Madrid and Barcelona again, even though Barcelona started out slow and found themselves in the Europa League. Bayern Munich's going to win the Bundesliga again. Now, Italy, Serie A, is going to be more competitive. Inter Milan, AC Milan, there's still a possibility for a surprise in that league, but for the most part, it's still top-heavy in the big leagues.
Well, that is what I wanted to investigate in this video, and it led me down a lot of interesting and unusual paths, along with a healthy dose of conclusions that I would love to share with you all. Here are my views on just what exactly is holding Major League Soccer back from becoming an elite-level football league. I must start, for obvious reasons, by addressing the elephant in the room, which some people will consider to be the beginning, middle, and end of this discussion, and that is the fact that football, or soccer, which is the word that I'll probably tend to use in this video, is not the most popular sport in the United States of America or in Canada. Now, that is so obvious that I have basically taken it as a given that everyone knows that, and of course it is a contributing factor that may be alluded to at other times, but it is not a point that I am going to dwell on.
It is a
I'm
factor.
not going to get into why it is
a factor.
the case that soccer hasn't historically been the biggest sport in the United States. I've talked about that too many times on this channel in the past, and the reality is that most of that context isn't actually relevant to the question posed in the title of this video. We have established that the MLS has made huge strides since its foundation, and in recent years. So clearly, it is capable of becoming a more popular and higher quality league without the need to monster every other major league sport in the United States and reign supreme, much like association football does, in a number of other countries.
It's a big tent. It's a very big tent. There's plenty of room for other sports, like football or soccer, if you want to call it. You're going to call it soccer, I'll call it soccer, to flourish. And you do see a lot of people, other sports stars from the NBA, NFL, Major League Baseball, that do watch and do support MLS.
The United States is the richest country in the world and has a sports-mad population. So it is definitely possible that the MLS could become an elite-level league without soccer having to overtake American football and baseball as America's favourite pastime.
It doesn't need to overtake baseball or football, and it's never going to overtake football, in my opinion. It doesn't have to overtake anything. It just has to find its place in the U.S. sporting culture and just exist. And people who love it can love it, and people who don't have to.
Look, I'm not saying that it is not an issue. Clearly it is. I'm just saying that it is the big obvious issue that may be interspersed throughout whilst being far from the only or even a decisive factor. But I wanted to get it out in the open to begin with, since I suspect it is the one that will have been on many of your minds, particularly for non-American viewers, to whom the nation's lack of unrivaled obsession with association football is almost the country's defining feature. Almost. One theory as to why Major League Soccer hasn't yet been able to compete with Europe's biggest leagues is because the MLS still imposes some fairly strict wage caps. Now, salary caps are fairly common in US sports, ironically I suppose, given America's obsession with the idea of the free market.
But the salary cap in MLS is a lot lower than it is in the other major league sports around the country.
It is interesting in some respects that Europe, which broadly speaking tends to have more regulation around things like anti-competition laws, has football leagues that operate almost like Wild Wests, where teams are able to establish monopolistic levels of control, buying up all of the best players, and hoovering up all of the biggest trophies. Meanwhile, in the United States, where the so-called invisible hand of the market is the only thing more sacred than the right of a 3-year-old to own their own gun, Major League sports are very heavily regulated, with far-reaching oversight at the league level. This is a slightly unusual phenomenon that has resulted in major US sports leagues, including the MLS, being much more open and competitive than most of, and certainly all of Europe's leading football leagues. The Premier League has had 5 different title winners over the last 10 seasons. Ligue 1 has had 4, La Liga has had 3, Serie A has also had 3, and the Bundesliga has only had 2. And most are as uncompetitive as they have ever been at this moment in time. The MLS, on the other hand, has been won by 8 different teams over the last 10 seasons. One of mine, and a lot of other people's biggest gripes about football in England and elsewhere, is that the idea of the Football League pyramid, where anyone can beat anyone, and where Manchester United could theoretically one day play in the National League and Halifax Town could reach the dizzying heights of the Premier League, has been gradually eroded over time, accelerated by the breakaway of the Premier League in 1992, reaching a point at which, now, we can basically say that it just isn't true.
Manchester United right now is not having the best year, but yes, Manchester United. I don't see them dropping down, and I don't see Halifax 10 moving up.
So there are definite benefits to the American system, but it does limit the amount of money that a team can spend, and therefore, in theory at least, and I would argue in practice, the caliber of player that they are able to sign and retain. This isn't really a problem with a lot of US sports.
It's not a problem with the NFL because nobody really plays that sport around the world. I mean, I know they have a league in Canada, and maybe they have some leagues around the world, but I don't know. The only ones I know is the United States and in Canada. So you don't have to worry about your best players leaving, going to make more money in some other country. They're going to stay right here in the United States.
Sports, such as American football, where the NFL is just about the only show in town. But association football is global, and if players can get better deals elsewhere, oftentimes they will simply go there.
That's Weston McKennie right there in his Juventus shirt. Now, MLS would love to have Weston McKennie play for them, but he's making too much money in Europe right now, and that's why he's going to go there. And you're not really going to attract the top players. You know, Messi in his prime wasn't going to come to the MLS. Ronaldo wasn't going to come to the MLS. I don't care how much you offered him.
If the NFL's $182.5 million salary cap meant that Jerome Baker wasn't happy with the contract extension offered to him by the Miami Dolphins, he is hardly likely to up sticks, move to Slovakia, and join the Bratislava Monarchs in the Austria Football League.
See, I didn't even know there was an Austria Football League.
But if Daryl Dike can earn more money at West Bromwich Albion than he can with Orlando City, he might just go and join the Baggies, just as he did in January 2022.
Even though he's injured right now.
To counteract this, the MLS has had the designated player rule since 2007, which allows each of the league's franchises to have up to 3 players in their squad, or roster, at any one time who operate outside of their salary cap.
The David Beckham rule.
It was the designated player rule that brought David Beckham to Los Angeles in 2007, Thierry Henry to New York in 2010, and Gonzalo Higuain to Miami in 2020. This has helped the MLS attract a handful of star players, such as those who I just mentioned, but obviously, by its very nature, they are limited in number, which presents another dilemma for clubs as to whether they recruit designated players based primarily on their ability and what the team needs, or on their fame, profile, and likely profitability in terms of things like selling shirts and getting fans through the turnstiles.
Now, Bastian Schweinsteiger played for the Chicago Fire, but I'm pretty sure that if you went to Chicago and that's 10, 20 people on the street who Bastian Schweinsteiger was, when he was playing there, I'd be surprised if you could find a whole lot of people who knew who he was, even though he was on their team.
Basically, do you sign Steven Gerrard or Miguel Almiron? That is a question that has troubled MLS teams pretty much since the league, and certainly since the designated player rule's inception, with a definite shift towards talent and team requirements in recent years. It is worth noting that you do sometimes get the best of both worlds with a signing like Zlatan Ibrahimovic or Carlos Vela, but more often than not, there is a conflict between those two sets of ambitions. It should also be said that commercial considerations are taken into account when European teams sign players and in contract negotiations. It has just historically been less of a consideration than in America, going all the way back to the NASL days. However, because the MLS cannot outcompete the biggest spending European teams, even with designated player status, nor can it offer the highest standard of football,
MLS does not want to be a retirement league.
the league has tended to attract big-name players once they are in the autumn of their careers. Hence the need for compromise between status and more soccer-orientated considerations. Now the MLS is keen to rid itself.
Lothar Matthäus, when he played in MLS, was not one of the more popular players. I was at the All-Star game, and he was on the All-Star team. And every time he touched the ball, he was booed by the fans. Lothar Matthäus did not really endear himself to the MLS when he was here.
Of its status, outside of the US at least, as a retirement league. And I think the steps that have been taken in that direction are mostly laudable. Salary caps could easily be considered a secondary issue, though, since they are designed to ensure sustainability and open competition, meaning that if league revenues were to increase, so too would those salary caps. If the MLS brought in the same amount of revenue as the NFL, they too would have a salary cap closer to $180 million than $4.24 million.
They'd also be able to sign anybody who they wanted to sign. The problem with that, though, however, is MLS's season. MLS's season starts in February and goes through November to December, I think is when the MLS final is generally played. While the rest of the world goes August to May. And that would be if you signed some of the best players and had some of the best salaries, you'd really be messing up the calendar, especially with World Cup and Euros and Copa America whenever those came around. So that's not. Now I do apologize for the ads. I'm going to try and speed through those. I can't avoid them.
Here
I have lost 25 pounds with Noom.
I've lost 97 pounds with Noom.
I've lost 25.
Here we enter into a bit of a catch-22 scenario, which is one that I will circle back round to in just a minute, but in terms of increasing MLS revenue, the biggest barrier has long been TV audiences, and therefore the value of the MLS's broadcast deals.
Now, MLS does have pretty good. You can watch all the games, any game you want, whenever MLS is playing in the United States. That's not a problem, but he is correct about it. The viewing audience generally doesn't pay much attention to MLS when it's on TV. Now, they will play some of the big games like El Tráfico, which was LA Galaxy versus LAFC. They played that on a broadcast on Fox. They played that on Fox, which is one of the broadcast networks, and they'll do that as well for the Bundesliga match between Bayern Munich and Borussia Dortmund. But majority of games you either have to stream them, but you can get them. You have ESPN Plus, you can stream them, or on cable.
There was a similar problem with the North American Soccer League in the 1970s and 80s. US soccer has no problem selling out arenas in a handful of cities. But
that we just showed right there was called the Big House. That's up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. That's not a big major city, but they put over 100,000 fans in to see Real Madrid play Manchester United in a preseason match.
But drawing Super Bowl or NBA final-like television viewing figures, or even just putting up consistently decent numbers, is a whole different ballgame. Quite literally, of course, if you will pardon the pun. One of the leading ways in which the NFL and the NBA market themselves and are marketed is around their star players. It doesn't matter if you follow the NFL or the NBA or not, most Americans know that Tom Brady was a pretty good quarterback, who was synonymous with the New England Patriots prior to his last 2 NFL seasons. And most know that LeBron James is quite good at throwing the round thing into the hoop, and that currently the Lakers are very grateful that he is so good at it. They are less likely, however, to know that Carlos Hill plays for New England Revolution, or even to have the faintest idea of who he is in all truth, despite the fact that he was the 2021 MLS MVP. That is partly because Tom Brady and LeBron James are all-time greats in their respective sports, and Carlos Hill isn't. Indeed, he was playing in Spain's second division before moving to the United States, and was previously relegated from the Premier League at Aston Villa. And that is an ongoing issue that the MLS faces.
There's a lot of teams in MLS, and I'll be honest with you, there's a lot of players who you wouldn't even know if you heard them. If I give you 5 names, pick the MLS player, you probably wouldn't be able to do it. In fact, I can't even do it. As much MLS as I watch, there are just so many players out there who you just don't know who they are, and they're just not recognizable. Now, the reason why college football, baseball, basketball, and those other sports do well is not just name recognition. Also, they market it as well, as we know. But the other thing, the big thing, is that the sports networks, the ESPNs, market them as well, and that's where they get their ratings from. And so if you watch ESPN, you know who these people are. They're going to tell you, even if you don't care for the sport, you know who they are. They don't do ESPN does not carry, even though they'll show a lot of soccer, they won't carry a lot of information. The Sports Center won't tell you who these people are. You probably know more what's going on in England, the players from the England in the English Premier League, than you do MLS players.
Like every other major league sport in the United States, the MLS cannot market itself as being the best league in the world or as having the best players that its sport has to offer. Major League Baseball calling its annual championship the World Series, and the NFL crowning the Super Bowl winners as...
That's something that happens all the time. They call it the World Champion. I won a World Champion. Now in NFL, I suppose you can do that because nobody else plays it really for the most part. But they do play basketball around the world. But the best league is in the NBA. They call it the World Series. Well, they do play baseball regionally around the world, but the best league is Major League Baseball. MLS can't make that claim.
World champions is often ridiculed by Europeans, since those competitions are exclusive to the US, and it does seem a little bit silly if nothing else. But even if it is factually incorrect, they are at least legitimately probably the best baseball and American football teams on the planet. If the MLS were to rebrand its playoffs as being the Club World Cup, or started crowning the MLS Cup winners as football's world champions, that would seem obviously even more absurd.
As absurd as that would sound, I'll bet you if you did it, I bet you if the next team that wins the MLS Cup calls themselves the MLS World Champions, the majority of Americans would probably believe that. They probably wouldn't even know enough about the sport to go and say, well, aren't you, what about those teams over in Europe? What about those teams over South America, Africa, Australia, Far East? They're not going to, they wouldn't know enough about the sport to dispute it. They probably would have to be told that they aren't really the true world champions.
Even to the most insular of American soccer fans. This is undoubtedly an issue that the MLS has to grapple with in a land that is sometimes obsessed with being and having the biggest and best of everything. And the catch-22 scenario that I alluded to earlier on is the paradoxical idea.
Met Robbie Keane. I have a picture of him on my phone. I got a selfie with him.
That in order to sign better players and pay higher wages, the MLS must bring in more revenue. But that in order to bring in more revenue, the MLS must first sign better players and pay higher wages. In reality, the MLS salary cap is unlikely to be removed anytime soon. Not only is it an ingrained part of Major League sports in the United States, it is also a hangover in some respects from the NASL era of American soccer, along with the near collapse of the league at the beginning of the 2000s, and a constant, perfectly legitimate fear that it now lives with of going out of business and having to live within its means.
I'm about ready to have another commercial here. I'll try and get through it as fast as I can. I apologize.
There are those who feel that the MLS doesn't need to be able to boast Lionel Messi, Cristiano Ronaldo, and Mohamed Salah within its ranks, and have teams that could put Real Madrid and Manchester City to bed by the first half in order to market itself and its star men more effectively though, and who feel that the league has fundamentally failed to do nearly enough when it comes to shouting about what they have already got. When LA Galaxy signed Dave...
Now, one of the things that MLS has actually done that actually has been good is that they've been pretty good at signing youth players from South America. A lot of the South American young players who maybe Europe they aren't ready for Europe just yet, have been signed by some of the better MLS clubs and making a name for himself that way.
David Beckham in 2007, the media coverage was unlike anything US soccer had ever seen. The result was a 23% uptick in TV audiences whenever Beckham played, compared to the average MLS television viewership, showing the importance of star power in US sport. Admittedly, up 23% from what was then a very low base. Beckham's arrival in the States ultimately proved to be a bit of a damp squib, owing to a persistent ankle injury that prevented him from making a real Hollywood entry.
The other thing about David Beckham, David, I think he played 6 years in the league, played 6 seasons for the MLS. Yeah, he came in injured, and they tried to get him everywhere so he could play. They really messed it up for all intents and purposes when David Beckham came. In the 6 seasons, he only played. I'm in Columbus, Ohio. He only played 1 time in Columbus after 6 seasons. And a couple of those times was because the manager, Bruce Arena, said, I don't know if it was in his contract that he didn't have to play every week or whatever it was, but sometimes Bruce Arena would send him home and say, no, I don't need you for this game, even though they could use him for that game, even though Columbus sold out their arena based on the fact that David Beckham was going to be there. He only played 1 time in Columbus.
But the MLS has failed to drum up that kind of interest for any of its subsequent starmen. Sebastian Giovinco was an Italian international and 2-time Serie A title winner when he joined Toronto FC at the age of only 28. And if his dazzling performances in Canada didn't give the MLS and American and Canadian broadcasters enough to shout about, it is difficult to know what will. Similarly, David Villa, whilst past his best by the time that he signed for New York City FC, was a World Cup, European Championship, and Champions League winning forward, and one of the finest forwards.
We could go through a whole list of players who played for an MLS from top European clubs who may have won a World Cup. I mentioned we saw Lothar Matthäus, David Villa, and a great number of Claudio Lopez. I know he didn't win a World Cup, but he played for Argentina in the World Cup. There's been a number of great players who've made it over to MLS, but not too many people knew who they were.
Of his generation, no less, who was lethal in the MLS, bagging 80 goals in 126 games. Giovinco ought to have become a household name in Toronto, and likewise Villa in New York, just as Beckham was in Los Angeles. Whilst the debate around the
Beckham was known more for the fact that he was friends with Tom Cruise and Will Smith, despite the slap, than anything else. I mean, there was a big Hollywood welcome to L.A. for David Beckham when he arrived, and he was him with Victoria, with David, with Tom Cruise and Will Smith, and you certainly didn't see that with anybody else.
Impact of Beckham's arrival in Major League Soccer is one that still rumbles on to this day in some quarters. It would be foolish to claim that it had no impact at all. However, one of the consequences of soccer's uptick in popularity was that, for the first time, European football began to be broadcast routinely on American televisions, and much of the sport's new interest in America was diverted towards the Premier League or La Liga rather than the MLS. This is
as I said, there's a lot of people who follow English Premier League in the United States probably could name more players in the English Premier League than they can their MLS team.
Problem that still plagues the MLS. There are many fans of MLS teams, unlike most fans of English teams, for example, who might watch their own team's games and even follow them religiously, but they are far less likely to set aside a couple of hours to watch Portland Timbers versus LAFC, Vancouver Whitecaps versus Minnesota United, or any of the other fixtures involving their divisional rivals.
But to be fair, there's a lot of people who wouldn't set aside time, even if they had it, to watch Aston Villa play against Leeds United. They wouldn't just put time aside to watch Norwich City play Burnley. Okay, there's a couple. This works both ways, but the thing is, the MLS, you sometimes have to go searching for these games. Okay, you'll find them, but sometimes you have to go searching for them. You won't have to go searching very far to find Norwich versus Burnley. So I certainly didn't.
English football fans, on the other hand, might support Arsenal, Accrington Stanley, or Aldershot Town, but will still watch Manchester United versus Liverpool on Super Sunday or Monday Night Football. A great many fans of MLS teams will also watch Manchester United versus Liverpool, or alternatively, just watch another sport like hockey or basketball, when other MLS teams are playing live on television. It must be said that The MLS could seemingly do more to circumvent the latter problem by working to avoid fixture clashes with other sports, particularly the really obvious ones such as clashes with big games involving local
Comes
teams.
another commercial.
I'm a millionaire. I'm not a millionaire. I'm a millionaire.
The issue of people being Colorado Rapids or Toronto FC fans, but not necessarily MLS fans, or in some instances, not even soccer fans, is one which is not unique to the MLS. I know plenty of Irish people who have a League of Ireland team that they support, but if you give them the choice of watching two League of Ireland teams that they don't support versus any random Premier League game, they will watch the Premier League game 9 times out of 10. And the exception is only because they sometimes televise Burnley games. I'm only joking, Burnley fans. I actually enjoy watching Burnley mix things up a bit. They are quite a unique team to watch in the Premier League these days.
Glad you think so. They got beat by Norwich 2-0 after beating Everton 3-2.
I'm backtracking, I know, because I don't want any hassle in the comments or on Twitter, but I really do mean it. It would be remiss of me in this video not to mention the eternal debate over whether American soccer needs to implement promotion and relegation. That is a topic that could well be an entire video.
Promotion and relegation will never work in the United States, in my opinion. The reason why these are franchises. These are teams that pay $40 million or whatever it is to get a team, and all of a sudden you're going to tell them you're in the lower division. Relegation and promotion has never been a part of American sports, not in any way, shape, or form. And to all of a sudden bring that in there, it might be exciting. In fact, it probably would be exciting, but I don't think it would ever fly. I don't think, and I'm not talking about the fans, I'm talking about the ownership group. You want to tell one of them that, hey, guess what? Your club is now going to be playing in a lower league. They're not going to go for that.
Video all on its own. And I have almost made exactly that video a couple of times in the past. But in the context of this video, and whilst I think that not having promotion and relegation as a European is basically tantamount to treason, I don't think that it would actually solve most of the problems at hand. There is a chance that it would actively make things quite a lot worse, and it is a non-starter. That is to say, it's never going to happen, or at least it's not going to happen for decades, hence why I haven't actually got around to making an entire video about it yet.
It's not going to happen at all.
There is an argument to say, I think, that if every American's local soccer team, regardless of their standing or status, were capable of one day competing in the MLS, and by winning promotion enough times, I mean, rather than simply purchasing a spot in the league, perhaps they would feel greater attachment and engagement to the league, particularly from those who are without a local MLS team.
In fact, there are a lot of people in the United States, going back to promotion and relegation, who don't understand how in England how you can win the league without having a playoff. As far as they're concerned, it makes no sense that once you get to the end of the season, the team that's in first place during the regular season wins the championship. To them going, what about the playoffs? Didn't you qualify the playoffs? It would make sense to them if say you had the top 8 teams in the Premier League, went on a little playoff thing and had a championship that way. It would make sense if the 8th place team was labeled English Premier League champion, and they go all the way to the Champions League that way. That's something that makes no sense to Americans. Why you don't have a playoff in the English Premier League? You know, Manchester United might actually like that this season.
I don't think most non-league football fans expect to see their team compete in the Premier League anytime soon in England, but it is at least theoretically possible. And football fans in Bournemouth, Blackpool and Bristol, whilst they may not have a Premier League team for miles around, certainly do feel as though the league is attainable for their teams in a way that it simply isn't for a soccer fan who lives and supports a team based in, say, Tucson, Arizona. Even the example of...
It's pronounced Tucson, Arizona, not Tuscan, Arizona, but point taken.
A non-league football fan in England, where the connection to the Premier League may feel much more remote, it is worth noting that Luton Town were playing 5th tier football as recently as 2014. Now they are battling for a playoff spot in the Championship, which would put them within 3 games of reaching the Premier League. These things can happen when you have promotion and relegation.
In the MLS, if you buy a franchise, you automatically are in the top flight.
They can't without it. But as I say, I still don't think that it is a silver bullet in the context of today's video, nor is it a realistic prospect in the MLS anytime soon. Exactly a year ago, perhaps even to this day, I made a video talking about why MLS teams are obsessed with rebranding. Give it a watch if you haven't already. It is totally rad, as an American might say. Or at least, as the American that I have just invented.
I don't think I've ever heard the term rad since the mid-1980s, but okay.
In my head might say. It's possible that I'm getting confused between Americans and the turtle out of Finding Nemo, but that's not important. In that video, I talked a little bit about the desire from certain sections of the MLS to replicate the European model to a T, with the Europeanization of club badges, names, and so on.
Enjoy unlimited DVR storage and never worry about hidden.
It is inevitable that European football will influence American soccer, but as I said in that video,
this is a photo from the old days when you had the shootout. MLS teams, the first year of MLS would play, they played to a tie, they'd have a shootout where a player would line up with the ball in the 35 yards away from goal and go one-on-one with the goalkeeper. And if you won the shootout, you won the game. They also introduced a 10-minute overtime for a tie. Those have long since gone away, and a draw is a draw like it is around the world, and that's the way it should be.
Personally, I think that it is important for American soccer and the MLS to retain their own identity and its own subtle set of American charms. Some Europeans will always sneer at the MLS, whatever they do, but it is not them that the league needs to win over. The focus, first and foremost, must be on their own domestic audience. And there, a combination of American quirks, whilst retaining football's soul, would seem to me to be the best formula. Whenever there is a discussion surrounding the success or failure of American soccer, people always bring it back to the issue that I began this video talking about: the lack of ingrained soccer culture in the United States compared to in Europe, Africa, and Latin America.
I mentioned about the fact that some of the teams over in Europe are over 100 years old. There are some teams in the United States are predate the league. The Portland Timbers, Seattle Sounders, even though they aren't actually, like the Seattle Sounders went defunct after the NASL went out, but the fans wanted to call the Sounders. But they actually do have somewhat of a history that goes back a little bit further than the MLS does. But he is right. There is not a. It'll be interesting where MLS is in 2096 when some of these teams are 100 years old, and how big the fans have gotten for and how much they enjoy the game then.
However, there is actually plenty of soccer culture, certainly in large parts of the United States, but far less, I sense, among the chief executives and decision makers at major US broadcasters. That means that there is less appreciation among those networks for soccer's potential in America, and less willingness to...
Ironically, Fox, that he has right there, actually does show some football, or soccer, sorry, in the on a regular basis on their broadcast channel, and they are going to be hosting the 2022 World Cup and 2026 World Cup. So it's interesting that he chose Fox Sports here when Fox Sports actually does a pretty good job of showing the games on network television.
To go big when it comes to broadcasting the MLS and promoting it like they do with other sports. It has been suggested that many of them simply don't get it, so to speak, and that could explain the lack of real narratives and story arcs that have been developed around teams, managers, players, rivalries, and the like. In the Premier League, Sky Sports and BT Sport will waste absolutely no time building a certain narrative around a player returning to a former club, bad blood between former teammates, or even the romance of certain scenarios. Part of that is made possible because of the amount of history.
That's Rob Stone on the left right here, and on the right is Lexi Lawless, who's been described as the Don King. If you don't know who Don King is, you can look him up, of American soccer. I mean, Lexi Lawless was touting the MLS while it was still in its infancy, and has not slowed down any. Scored a nice goal against England in the 1993 U.S. Cup, by the way, as well.
Within the English game that may be lacking with some American soccer teams, but there is still a great deal more that could be done with regards to the MLS. Whilst the NFL is enormous in America, it is not just the games themselves that attract such great interest, but everything that goes around them. UK viewers might think that I am alluding to the halftime show at the Super Bowl and the like, but I mean even simpler things, like fantasy football. Here in England, Fantasy Premier League is a pretty big deal.
Fantasy football in the United States with the NFL is massive. It is huge. And everybody play, I play it. It's something that if you don't care much about the NFL, say you didn't care anything about football at all, but you did fantasy football for money, for bets, that gets you interest. That's a way to show interest. You have fantasy football, and if you want to see your player do well, you want to see how they're doing. So what are you going to do? You're either going to watch the game, or you're going to look it up on the internet to see how they're doing, and see if you won the game. So fantasy football really does bring a lot of interest into the game.
I've got a couple of mates who devote more time to it than they do to their full-time jobs, but it is still fairly minor in comparison to the tremendous amount of interest in the NFL's Fantasy Football League, which plays a huge role in the overall NFL experience and popularity, particularly among young supporters. There is a fantasy MLS game which, as far
The thing about the NFL, though, is that NFL is based on stats, statistics, touchdowns, rushing yards, throwing yards, things like that make it easy to follow and draft and so forth. So I think NFL, because it's based on that, just makes it a much easier and more exciting prospect than anything MLS or even the English Premier League fantasy sports would do. At least that's my opinion.
As far as I'm aware, was growing gradually up until a few years ago when they completely altered the format of the game. Fantasy MLS used to function pretty much the same as Fantasy Premier League, for any of you who play that, just with an extra free transfer each game week since the MLS has more blank game weeks than the Premier League. But in 2018, the format was changed so that managers could pick an entirely new team for every single game week. If you have played any kind of fantasy sports game, you will know how taxing that would become, requiring you to research every game every week and update your entire team accordingly. As such, at the last count, there were fewer than 50,000 fantasy MLS teams compared to almost 10 million fantasy football teams, and the vast majority of fantasy MLS players are inactive by the end of the season, whilst fantasy football players are so active on the game's app that it is estimated to cost American companies between $6.5 to $17 billion a year in lost workplace productivity. I have talked about many challenges, questions, and have even offered up perhaps one or two solutions to the issue of growing the MLS and preventing.
I do apologize for those little commercial breaks. I'm sorry. I'll try and edit those out. I'm still new at this, so one day I'll get the hang of it.
The league from stagnating. But whilst this is a topic that I've seen brought up in the past, hence why I was keen to investigate it, it is worth noting that it is far from being all doom and gloom for Major League Soccer. The increase in youth participation and in youth development alone provide great cause for optimism. Meanwhile, baseball's popularity, particularly among young people, is dwindling, hockey is as well, and American football is not free from its own trouble, while soccer continues to grow in both the United States and Canada.
One of the best things about having the Premier League in the United States and being accessible is it's basically turned the youth soccer into a very, very big market very, very popular in the United States. It's also some of the better athletes that the United States produces are starting to play it and try and make their move into the league as well. You're starting to see a lot more players from the United States go to Europe. Now, keep in mind, Europe is still the goal for a lot of the youth players in the United States. Yeah, you want to play for MLS, you'll gladly play for MLS, but when Christian Pulisic went over to Borussia Dortmund and started making waves there, a lot of players like Josh Sargent and Weston McKennie said, hey, I can do that too. And now you see a lot more Americans plying their trade over in Europe.
There is a whole generation now of young Americans and Canadians who have grown up as soccer fans following the MLS. That has never previously been the case. The 2026 World Cup is also likely to be enormous in terms of giving soccer's popularity a further boost and cementing the sport further within the American psyche, which can only be good news for the MLS. They say that patience is a virtue and that Rome wasn't built in a day.
The other thing about the World Cup is the World Cup is generally big in the United States. Since 1994, when the World Cup was hosted by the United States, since then, the World Cup is a huge market. I remember 2002 when the games were played like 1:30, 4 o'clock, and 5:30, whatever it was in the morning. They were played overnight. They still attracted fans to watch them in droves. People would literally get up for work at 3 o'clock in the morning or 4 o'clock in the morning, whatever it was, to watch. And the U.S., I think, played Portugal at 5:15 a.m. is when that game kicked off and drew a huge crowd at Columbus Crew Stadium to watch that. And so even during it was played in the Far East, in Japan and South Korea, it drew a huge audience to watch it. And even in 2018, when the U.S. did not qualify, it drew a huge audience. So, yeah, he's saying Rome wasn't built in a day and things like that. But I think MLS is here to stay, and I think it's only going to get bigger.
And by the same token, the MLS doesn't need to be bigger than the Premier League in order to be deemed as a success, and it certainly doesn't need to achieve that status overnight. It just needs to keep on developing, and there are plenty of reasons to believe that, whilst far from perfect, the league is heading in the right direction. That is it for today's video, which is one that I wasn't initially sure whether I should make at all, but has ended up being really rather extensive. I thoroughly hope that you enjoyed it regardless. Go ahead and hit the like button if that...
Yeah, hit the like button and subscribe to HITC7's video. Why isn't the MLS rivaling Europe's big league yet? And I thought this was an interesting video, an interesting take, and I was more than happy to give my 2 cents on it. And please hit like and subscribe for me as well if you enjoyed the video. I hope you did. I hope to do more of this content and give you my 2 cents worth. I'm in the United States. I've been to quite a few MLS games. I've even traveled as far as, I'm in Columbus, I've even traveled as far as Seattle to watch the Columbus Crew play. I've been to quite a few games in Los Angeles. If you have any questions, you can ask me about them. But yeah, MLS is a fun league to watch, exciting league to watch. But it's still very much in the infancy stage compared to a lot of the leagues that are around the world. But I still enjoy it, and I hope you get a chance to, if you get a chance to see an MLS game, if you ever come to America, you'll enjoy it. Thank you.